Okay. Do you want me to wait? Should we get started?
We can get started. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Wael Diab. I chair the joint committee between IEC and ISO on artificial intelligence. And I'm going to be giving you a presentation about what all the exciting topics we've been covering in AI. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll periodically check and take a break to answer. So just want to quickly say thanks to a few people. So we are technical program managers, Jose, Andy, Heather, our committee manager, the IEC communications team, ISO communications team, and Sylvia for organizing this. In terms of an agenda, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about the AI market opportunity, get into some of the highlights of what SC42 is doing, and then I'll leave you with some concluding remarks. So in terms of when I think of what we're doing in this committee, it's really part of a bigger theme that we see in terms of digital transformation, where certain IT technologies are being used to enable the digitization of different verticals. In our case, we focus on two types of technologies. One is the artificial intelligence. And as you can see from the picture on the left, it's broader than just a single technology, can include software and hardware, as well as some of the data science and ecosystem. This had originally started with the inclusion of the big data program of work, but has since expanded to include data aspects for AI and analytics that we'll talk about in a little bit. In terms of just, giving you a little bit of background about AI, I mean, AI is not a new, it's not a new topic. It's been around for quite some time. Some of the things that have changed are the compute capability underneath that makes it viable to use in a wide array of applications. And then the other thing is really the use cases. And we no longer see AI as kind of being this sort of, people might remember, beating a chess player, for example, or some unique big problem, but rather it's helping out in a large number of applications, from healthcare to smart manufacturing to financial ecosystems. In many cases, there might be a learning algorithm operating in the background without people being actually aware that it's a learning algorithm. There are a number of different marketing estimates that talk to the same thing, but essentially, looking forward, about 75% of enterprise applications by next year will use some form of artificial intelligence. So this growing demand for digital transformation and this learning technology really makes it ripe for the ecosystem to be standardized. And so what do we mean but when we talk about the ecosystem? As I mentioned earlier, AI is not a single technology, but a collection of technologies. And we are increasingly seeing more stakeholders being engaged, not just those that are designing the technology, but many using it in their different vertical applications, as well as, some, whether it's regulators or, social behavioral type of scientists that are also interested in this. So it's a little bit broader than just looking at the technical requirements. And one of the things our committee tries to do is to marry those non-technical requirements to technical requirements for the technology. In terms of how we're structured, we've got 6 different working groups, and I'll go through some of the topics they cover in a bit. The first one looks at foundational standards, the second one on data, third one on trustworthiness, fourth on use cases and applications, the fifth on computational approaches and characteristics of AI systems. And then we also have a joint working group with a sister committee under JTC1, SC40, which we are looking at governance implications of AI. let me pause for a second just to see if there's any questions already. And it doesn't look like it is yet. And I will periodically try to do this throughout the presentation just to make sure if there are questions that we try to catch them more in real time. So a little bit more about the committee. The committee's scope is quite broad, but specific to AI. So it's standardization in the area of AI. That should not come as a surprise. And then we serve as a focal point for the JTC1 program on AI. And for those of you that are not aware, JTC1 is a joint program between IEC and ISO in the area of IT. The other thing that we're tasked with is we call it a system integration committee, and we provide guidance to other committees in IEC, ISO, and JTC1 looking at artificial intelligence applications. Something that is quite unique in terms of how we're set up, and I believe is very helpful in terms of adoption of AI. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. To give you a quick bird's eye view of what we've done so far, we've completed all of our big data foundational work that's been published. Our first deliverable on AI trustworthiness, 24028, was published earlier this year. And we're close to publication of our AI use cases. We've collected over 130 different use cases from a number of verticals. We've grown quite a bit for being a relatively young committee. We have 21 active projects, 11 of which were added just over the last year. And we have now 47 national bodies or national committees that are participating in SC42. Typically, pre-COVID, we've had about 150 people show up to our plenary meetings, and on the virtual ones, we run around a little above 200. We have extensive outreach, and as I mentioned earlier, the IEC and ISO teams have been fantastic with this. We also believe that the best way to help adoption and address all the issues is to work through with partners, both internal and external. So some of the external ones, like some of the new liaison relationships, have been with OECD and the European Commission. We are also working on, we have also set up some internal collaboration, as an example, one with IEC TC65, SC65A, looking at functional safety and AI. A few also key highlights that have happened over the past year. We've expanded the scope of the big data working group to include data in the context of AI, big data, and analytics. And I'll talk more about that when we get to it. Without going through the laundry list of different projects that we have started, you can see that we've expanded into a number of new areas in the ecosystem. Like, we have a new series on data quality. We also have a new project on guidelines for AI applications and others. I will talk more about those when we get to the specific area. We have a very healthy pipeline of ideas that comes to us from our members, as well as from our liaison partners, internal and external. And then we've made quite a bit of progress on some of the key projects, like the foundational projects that I'll overview in a second, risk management and governance implications of AI. So I'm going to, again, just quickly check to see if there's any questions before I go on.
We have a few questions on the chat. Do you want me to read them out?
Sure. I have them, so I can read them. I think the first question is, how do you receive the requests from other committees? Do you reach out, or are they coming to you? And perhaps related to that is, how do you choose from the use cases, or do you consider all of them? Those are great questions from Ralph. So in terms of the requests from the committee, they do come to us in different ways. Some are generated directly by our national committee members. In terms of proposing new projects, we typically take advantage of discussing the project before sending it out for approval. Others can come in through requests from liaison partners as well. And in terms of building the relationships, it's also a mixture of different ways. We do get interest from some of the folks that are directly participating in our committee that have interest in other application areas, let's say, or other related technology that that's being standardized, as well as, from just across the IEC and ISO families that we work with. The question about use cases is very interesting. So when we started collecting use cases, I don't think we anticipated getting as many and as quickly. And we don't pick and choose. We try to get as broad of a collection of use cases in different domains as we can. Our goal is to try and make our deliverables horizontal. So these use cases help us ensure that is the case. We're also doing a few novel things with use cases, like looking at ethical and societal concerns within the use cases. It's one of the exciting areas, and it definitely, at the very least, shows how diverse and exciting ways AI is being deployed. Thank you for those questions. Those were great. So the need for the ecosystem, I'm actually going to skip a little bit to this picture because I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. And as I mentioned earlier, we see quite a bit of what I would call non-technical trends and requirements. So there's a lot of application domain requirements that come up. So just following on to that discussion of the use case, for example, whether it's in the area of safety or whether it's in the area of how the software is going to be used or the system. We also have increasingly a number of interesting requirements coming from regulatory and policy, things like trustworthiness, transparency, explainability. And increasingly, we find some of these IT technologies are being used fairly broadly. So we have ethical and emerging societal requirements that that need to be addressed. And then last but not least, we also have things like business requirements and key performance indicators that where the goal is to be able to achieve something regardless of what the underlying technology does. So the first thing that we try to do with SC42 is almost assimilate these requirements for the context of use of AI, big data, and analytics. So we are a technical committee. We don't deal with the non-technical questions like what the policy should be for the use of AI, but we do deal with how those technologies will be used, their context of use, if you will. And from there, we develop what we call horizontal and foundational projects. So the goal here is to really enable and accelerate the adoption while addressing the concerns. So you might ask, what are these horizontal or foundational projects? And you can see in the deliverables and what should be shown as green, some examples, things like foundational concepts, terminology, reference architectures, frameworks, use cases, guidance and guidelines. These would form effectively what we would consider horizontal and foundational projects. And then on top of that, application standards that are domain specific can build on the SC42 horizontal deliverables. Open source projects, can leverage the ecosystem deliverables as well, and so can proprietary implementations. And ultimately, what you will see is that we would drive implementations across a diverse number of domains by allowing for these horizontal projects to come out. We also don't preclude the fact that SC42 would do deeper dive standards as well. And we expect some of that to come as the work matures as well. So in terms of, I've listed some of the key topic areas that we're dealing with, and, to kind of just use it as a launch point for discussion. So for foundational standards, these are, introduce an overview of the topic and include things like terminology, key concepts, and frameworks. They have become quite popular with, some of the more widely used technologies coming out. For example, some of our sister committees in JTC1 are doing the same thing. In our case, we use it to describe the AI machine learning ecosystem. And from a technology perspective, it really gives a description of the area and how the system is set up. It also provides for a cross-stakeholder viewpoint that can be that can include that can have a common language so that different people coming from different backgrounds can be able to talk about the same thing. An example I use for some of you that might remember in the 90s, we used the term information superhighway, right? And that could mean anything from dial-up to fiber to satellite. And depending on who was saying it, they had a different context. So we've come quite a ways since then. And this lets us be able to talk to each other in a common language and express our needs across the different stakeholders. And it really provides the building blocks for some of the other deliverables within SC42. So the two current projects that are open and well into their balloting stage are AI concepts and terminology and frameworks for AI systems using machine learning. There's also been a new project approved and assigned that I'll talk about at the end that's on the management system standard. And I'm going to pause again just to look at the chat to see if there are any questions. Okay, so Ralph is again asking for a little bit more detail on how we look at the use cases. And what I will do is I have a slide on the use cases and applications, so we can perhaps discuss that one there. Omar is asking, what can you say about interoperability in AI and related standards? That's a very good question, Omar. And yes, there is interoperability requirements, but those can happen on different levels. So at a very high abstract level, we need to be able to, at the very least, talk about, the system from different perspectives. So I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the application guidelines. And we also expect to see interoperability standardization happen at some of the lower layers as well. So both can happen. So far, we have another question from Sylvia saying, what is your impression of where AI is today? And that's another really good question. So as I mentioned earlier, AI is not a new topic. It's been around for quite some time. One of the things that we see is sometimes, people associate AI with full automation. And in many cases, these learning systems are operating on data to provide insights, and they aren't necessarily fully autonomous. They might be semi-autonomous systems operating, to help assist coming up with insights. For example, in a financial type of application. So the application is more prevalent than people might think, and it's also, as I mentioned, very different than how we would think about it 20 or 30 years ago, or from some of the sci-fi movies where, while there is a big application for AI for robotics, this sort of like self-aware robot is not something that is the main application of artificial intelligence. So moving on, the next topic is data. And this is a very interesting topic and an increasingly relevant topic for IT, as well as, the digital transformation when you look at application verticals. So when we look at the data, ecosystem characteristics, properties, and quality, in AI, big data, and analytics, we found that there's a lot of similarities, and it makes sense to kind of house this all in one working group in our committee. So big data deals extensively with big data sets, and it considers characteristics such as, you might have heard of the 5 V's: volume, variety, velocity, variability, and it allows for technology to be scaled and be more efficient, and compute architectures to be designed around the properties of the data sets rather than just have one general compute architecture. So from that perspective, big data is looking at data aspects like quality and characteristics. AI systems acquire, process, and apply knowledge, which in of itself relies on data, its properties and quality. And of course, a big part of artificial intelligence is training these models to so that they can learn. And again, that all revolves around data, its properties and quality. And last but not least, whether you're using a big data system or a big data system with a learning algorithm like AI, the key thing here is to be able to get analytics. And analytics is really the derivation of insights from data, which requires things like data acquisition, collection, validation, and processing. So you can start to see how, these three different areas, when you look at it from the data perspective, there's a lot of relevance. There's a lot of expertise that is shared across, like having the need to have data scientists participate in this. And there are also some common concerns and issues that come up that cross the three domains. So for that reason, we in the last year, we transitioned this working group to encompass more than just big data and to house all the data relevant issues and expertise for 42. In terms of history, the big data work had started prior to SC42 being formed as a committee, and that was absorbed into the SC42 program of work, in part because of the reasons that I just stated and how it's similar from certain areas for AI. We also have, I mentioned this at the top of the call, completed our big data foundational work. This was two sets of standards. One was the terminology 20546, and the other was a 5-part series on the big data reference architecture, which 42 did 4 parts, and the security and privacy was done by a sister committee, SC27, looking in that area. So similar to the way we're dealing with AI, we had followed for the big data reference architecture. Some of the new work in this group is around the process management framework for big data analytics. So this is something that helps build on top of the big data reference architecture, and they are getting ready to move to the first committee balloting stage. We also have a new multi-part series. 3 parts have been approved for work, and there's a 4th being discussed on a series for data quality for analytics and machine learning. So we expect a lot of these concepts that I started talking about on the slide to be captured there. We also have a little bit of a sort of a study area road mapping activity. We have ad hocs in this area that look at AI data as well as data quality and road mapping. The next topic and working group that we've got is working group 3 that looks at trustworthiness. And this is currently one of our biggest working groups. And there's a tremendous amount of interest looking at issues that range from trustworthiness through security and privacy. And it's important to say within the context of AI, and more specifically within the horizontal context of AI, because we expect that we are not going to redo security and privacy. SC27 has a large number of successful standards. And then, of course, when you look at the application of AI within a domain, it is not just the IT portion that's important. We have to work in, you have to work hand in hand with the application domain and verticals and their standards. So to motivation, this is a hot topic due to the regulatory landscape. I believe, there's been a number of privacy laws, for example, in Europe that have touched on this. There's been a lot of discussion about social media engines in this. We have a lot of our key stakeholders view this as necessary for the success and broad market adoption of AI. And it's frequently discussed within the context of application areas. And we truly believe that international standards here will help tremendously. And one of the things when I was introducing the ecosystem concept that I perhaps skipped over is there has also been a change in terms of how we think about technology. Rather than, design, standardize the technology, and then worry about things like, its economic viability, or things like, let's say its energy footprint, or in this case, the security, privacy, trustworthiness after the fact. we are being proactive and trying to deal with these questions up front. We truly believe this will help the adoption. And it's also, frankly, a better way to go about this, because you're thinking about these questions at the beginning rather than at the end of the process. So we have a number of current areas of current work in this group. I mentioned the Trustworthiness project that was published. We were looking at things like AI bias and intended, unintended consequences. We have a couple of projects on robustness of neural networks. The first part is getting close to publication, and then we have a follow-up formal methodologies for the assessment of these networks, looking at some of the techniques that exist that can be applied here. We have a risk management framework that builds on the generic ISO 31000. And the idea here is to be able to take some of these concepts and really translate it into something that is technical and manageable, like risk management. We also are, in collaboration with JTC1 SC7, are working on an extension for the, or application rather, of the SQUARE, which is the systems and software quality requirements and evaluation for AI systems. We also, as I mentioned, have a new project that we're working on in collaboration with IEC TC65, SC65A, looking at functional safety and AI systems. And again, this is not going to be the whole inclusive universe of these things. We expect more to happen. So even with the last one that I mentioned, there's already been discussions of, once that's complete, what else can be done. We're also looking at potentially a new project in terms of explainability. And as you can see from the bottom, without, I know it's a bit of an eye chart, without actually reading all of these out, you can see some of these bolded terms. This group has a healthy ad hoc that looks at road mapping and dealing with some of these concepts to see how well we're treating them. Do we need something new to propose or not? And a lot of these terms you've probably seen in the discussions of AI. So I know this one's a big topic, and since I've covered a couple, I'm going to again pause and look to see if we have any more questions coming in. There's a question about how do you standardize self-learning AI, and how would you know that AI is still in line with the standard? That is a very good question. I'm going to perhaps take that one as we get closer to the end, where I talk about a new project we have on the MSS. How do you categorize the use cases? Again, lots of interest in use cases. And the short answer for that is we do look at different verticals that we do, and no system is perfect. We actually introduce our approach in the technical report itself. Another question is, when and how will different threads dealing with related aspects about AI be connected in the near future? That is a very good question. I would note that it is a little bit general. So we are trying to connect all these threads. As I mentioned, for instance, one of the things that we are looking at is taking a lot of these non-technical requirements and mapping them into technical requirements. So for example, something I just mentioned with the issue of trustworthiness, being able to use something like a risk management framework is one way that we achieve this. And I will talk a little bit more about that as we talk about ethics and societal concerns next. Quickly scanning, what are some of the barriers to widespread adoption? That is a great question from Antoinette. And there are, as one would expect with any technology, certain barriers to adoption, like showing the viability within different verticals and applications. And, that is consistent with any new technology being introduced. One of the nice things about being part of the IEC and ISO families is we can collaborate and work with our sister or cousin committees, whichever way you want to look at them, that are truly expert in these application areas, and relying on their expertise to see how the AI roadmap in their area would develop. And this is also quite important because, we will have a lot of AI expertise in our committee, but remember that, for any technology and vertical deployment, whether it be because of regulatory requirements or, industry requirements, there's a lot of expertise that's been built up over the years in these standardization bodies, and they are truly the better people to be able to talk to that specific roadmap of AI. So we benefit from being part of that. And then I think last but not least is being able to look at some of these issues proactively and dealing with them proactively, like, things like trustworthiness, security, privacy, ethics, rather than waiting until it becomes an issue down the line, and trying to design standards that are more horizontal and allow for integration of other standards as well that look at the deployment. That's a really good question. I'm going to go back to the presentation. I'll pick up some more questions in a second, and I can get back. Yeah. So this chart was done by a industry colleague of mine who works for Accenture, and he was trying to show, how the areas in yellow are really where the topics around ethical and societal issues are. And the things like job displacement, singularity are further out. So I asked if I could borrow it because it mapped quite nicely to how we think about the problem of ethical and societal issues, because being a technical committee, we do deal with those three issues on that are in yellow, and they are frankly the issues that are issues today, not some of these things that are much further away. So in terms of societal concerns and ethics, one can think of some of these transformative technologies like AI, big data, IoT. Their impact goes well beyond the technology because they end up being used in different aspects of our lives, whether it's at work or whether it's at home. More and more of these technologies are becoming part of our life. So on the one hand, we have issues that we have captured and learned how to deal with, like trustworthiness, reliability, privacy, and security. And on the other hand, like that picture showed, there are issues that go well beyond IT, like impact on labor force and economy that we don't deal with. So the terminology I like to use is we like to focus on this area that's the context of use of the technology, and then help link it back to some of the technical areas, or build upon some of the technical areas that we already understand, like trustworthiness. And we found that to be very useful. So to give you some examples of what this might be. So many people have heard of algorithmic bias. Some bias can be generated unintentionally because of the design of the model or because of the training. Things like safety directives in industrial AI is another one. The concept of eavesdropping, this notion that a machine can look at all types of data, not differentiate between different types of data that it shouldn't look at, where a human would know, for example, not to look at data or look for patterns that might promote discrimination. So these are some of the issues that come up in the context of use, and we try to provide this foundation to translate them into technical requirements that standards can be built on top of. So for AI, for ethical and societal concerns, we actually, the first thing to say is that this is not just limited to the work that our committee does, but this cannot be understated, that it's extremely important to also look at the IEC and ISO technical committees that are looking at the applications of AI, because they understand that area better than anyone else would. But we do want to work in conjunction with that. The second thing is that we actually have taken an approach to look at this topic rather than just within one group, horizontally across the whole program of work. So what you will see is some things, as I mentioned on the use cases, that we are asking questions like, what are your ethical concerns as we ingest these use cases in, and try to, then try to translate them to things like, their concern really translates to something like, bias or something like, data privacy. Not too different from if you think about the communications world, how there can be tons of requirements, and then there's an attempt to translate those down to things that are known and technical and can be handled, like bandwidth, latency, security, privacy. So it's a similar type of approach. And I gave the example of how it's being used in the use cases. And we also have specific projects that deal with this area. One that I would mention is the one on ethical and societal concerns that's being done in Working Group 3 on trustworthiness. And really the goal of this project is to tie these non-technical requirements, almost exactly like that picture that I showed, down to the work that we have been doing. It's not intended to be an exhaustive list, but more of a sample list that how stakeholders that include industry, regulatory, technology, interest groups, application domains, and society at large. Last but not least, in addition to working with other committees in ISO and IEC, this is extremely important, and it's a philosophy that we've pursued in SC 42. We collaborate with other work programs, things like the Partnership on AI, OECD. We've set up a liaison with the European Commission, and so on. And it is one of the ways that we can also reduce barrier to adoption is by collaborating with others, because we often find, even if there's an overlap in the topic, different groups bring different sets of expertise, so we can be complementary. So I am going to, again, look at the chat quickly, because I know sometimes this topic generates questions. And I apologize if I miss a question. I'll try to get back to all of them at the end. Singularity is a system capable of human level thinking, or that's a good question. I don't know the exact definition of that, but yes, it's this idea that, a self-sustaining system, and we're nowhere near that. You could think about it as, we're playing 2 dimensions, and that's something like 4 dimensions. So, but again, please feel free to find other sources that define that better. Is there work that is mature enough to derive conformity testing out of it? So again, I'm going to defer to that till we get to the MSS. A little more questions about definitions of self-learning AI. And we do have a document on definitions. I do not recall how we define that at the moment, but I can certainly follow up and come back afterwards. Use cases, more questions on use cases. And again, I will talk about that next. Another question is how to ensure that a system is trustworthy in terms of safety, security, reliability. Trustworthiness does not correlate linearly with trust, so one has to think about how to prevent overtrust. Where does that fit into the standardization efforts? That's a really good question. And again, I mean, I go back to this, and I'm sorry if it sounds like a general response, but it is really context driven. So one of the things I learned, I gave one of these presentations, I think it was either last year or the year before, to a really nice program that IEC runs called the Young Professionals. And one of the people that was in the presentation asked an interesting question about, this idea of trust and safety. And I started to explain how, from the IT perspective, we were dealing with it. And this gentleman came back and said, actually, IT doesn't have to solve every single problem and should look to how it would work with other areas, giving the example of how it's not uncommon in a smart manufacturing facility to bring up a new line or technology and run it in parallel with another one until you achieved a certain level of confidence in the technology. And similarly, within controllability, it doesn't. The problem can be a joint solution that comes from the technology side, like AI, but also from the operational side, where there's a limitation in terms of what the system can and cannot do, and what it looks at and what it analyzes. So I took that to heart to mean that this really reinforces the idea of having to work within the context of use of the technology. And I think if it's not the next slide, it's the one after it, I'm going to talk about one of our new projects that will really help this to go on. Sylvia's also just mentioned that there will be a similar young professional event next week. So for those that are interested to learn about it, and it is in the chat. So moving along with the presentation, the next topic is use cases and applications. So we had set this up, and I want to note something that this is, front and center within our scope. It's one of the two major bullets that we got when we were created, given life, so to speak, is to be able to provide guidance to other committees looking at AI applications across the entire two families of ISO and IEC. And so we take it very seriously. And for that reason, we have set up a working group to work on just that. The way I think about this is almost like a two-way exchange, that the use cases is almost like the currency that is used for committees to provide us what they are looking in terms of an application. And I think as one of the earlier questions, I think it was Ralph's, is how do we get these? And we do have quite a wide funnel. Sometimes they come in through our experts in the working group. We have also gone quite a bit through our liaison programs, both internally and externally. It's also one of the things that provides structure as we start to discuss with another committee how we can help them within their roadmap, because the use case really provides a level setting in terms of what we're looking at, what we might already have, and what we might not have. We do not discriminate against use cases. We try to bring in as many as we can. I believe what the convener of this group told me, that at one point we had to take a snapshot of the technical report. We had over 130, I think it was 135 use cases. I want to say from 23 or 25 different verticals. And again, we'd have to look at the document to see exactly how each of the verticals are defined, but suffice it to say, it was quite large. And the interesting thing is we had to take a snapshot so that we can have a publication, and we have already started to receive more. So we expect that this document will be revised frequently. I also want to mention that in the big data reference architecture that we did, part of that work also involved collecting use cases. If I'm not mistaken, I think that was part 2 of T0547. In that case, we had about 53 different use cases. A lot of times, we will work with others that have a use case. We don't want to continue to reinvent the wheel, but we are also cautious that we try to get as much information, especially since we've been looking at new domains. And in the reverse direction, what we try to provide is guidance. And this provision can happen in many different ways. One method, we can set up a joint working group together with another committee. Another method we can use, via liaison input in either direction, or simply, having experts shared. We try to do as much as we can. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb is if it's more horizontal, so it deals with a number of domains, it is something that would more likely fit in terms of what 42 would do. And if it's something that's domain specific, it would fit the other way. But again, we discuss this with every group that we do and try to accommodate their needs. Sometimes they ask us to take a lead on an initial project. So as I mentioned, so we look for things to be broad enough to be horizontal. So 2 really interesting new projects in this area that hopefully will help answer some of the questions is, one is on guidelines for AI applications. So if you look at, we did this with big data as well. So part of the big data reference architecture builds on ISO IEC IEEE 42010 and looks at the system from different viewpoints, one of which is an application viewpoint. So for the guidelines for AI application, it's a new project. We haven't made any decisions in terms of what we're using as the underlying framework, but the idea here is again to take a look at what we are delivering from the point of view of an application. And again, recognizing that application experts, while they may have an expertise on IT, they may not have as deep or need to have as detailed of an expertise as looking at some of our deep dive frameworks or standards, and B, looking at it from their point of view in what things are important. So almost like looking at the same problem from a different angle. And we believe that this standard is going to be extremely useful, as it will provide truly the guidance for how to build on top of our deliverables. And this has been assigned to Working Group 4. We also have one that we're working with in collaboration with SC7 on the life cycle for software developers that I mentioned at the top of the call. Again, the intention is to build on everything that's there. We recognize that there's a lot of good system lifecycle processes that have been done for software systems, for example, that we can build on, and we can address the additional delta that's for AI. Hopefully, just in the interest of time, I'm going to try and push through to the end, and then we can go back to some of the questions if I did not answer everything on use cases to deal with that at the end. The next area is computational methods. So this is at the heart of any AI technology. We are looking at computational approaches and characteristics of AI systems. We have three projects running here. The first is an overview of what's the state of the art of computational approaches for AI systems. This is, again, not an uncommon thing to do as we start looking at a new area to try and basically see what is out there, in this case, in terms of characteristics and algorithmic approaches that can be used. And again, back to the use cases, you can see how tightly we try to integrate this. For this particular project scoping, we included referencing use cases contained in 24030, which is the use cases document. We also have a technical specification on the assessment of classification performance for machine learning models and algorithms. This is not intended to grade algorithms, but rather provide for a framework that could be applicable across the industry to really treat to look at all the different aspects of algorithms. There's in any new field, whenever you have something come out, people emphasize different things, and we want to be able to have a document that can be used for classification of the performance, including things like treatment of bias, for example. So that will be a very exciting document once it's published, and will hopefully help future standards be built on top of it. We also recently approved a new project for work called the Reference Architecture of Knowledge Engineering. So this deals with, if you recall, when we talked about the data aspect, there's a lot of data acquisition, capture, and treatment that's at the front end cycle of AI, and this project attempts to address some of that. Governance implications of AI, as I mentioned, we're really fueled by this digital transformation, and perhaps that word has gone overused now, but AI technologies are rapidly being adopted across different industries and geographic locations. So the need to address governance implications has become very important. And the idea here is to really look at, what some of the questions that may come from whether it's an organizational board or executives or people looking to make decisions on the technology that are not necessarily down at that technical level, to try and anticipate what some of these questions may be, and providing answers using the work that we have done, but in a way that is easy, that addresses that audience. And again, here we are doing this jointly with our sister committee, SC40, that looks at IT governance. And we are relying on their expertise as well in terms of how we can approach, identifying these questions and answering them. A new topic that we have is we have a new project approved that is going to initiate work in Working Group 1 this month. And this is it's called the Management Systems Standard. And the idea here is that, the AI technologies bring AI-specific concerns beyond those of traditional IT systems, right? So many of the learning algorithms may provide different results depending on the training data set that is used. So the choice of the training data when using the AI system is an additional process that an organization looking to use AI needs to go through to ensure that the intended overall performance is met. And I'm sure you can get on your favorite search engine and look. There's plenty of stories about how if AI is either the model itself is not designed with enough care, or what we have seen more frequently, depending on the training data set, the performance is different. So that is one thing. The other thing is consumers of AI products and services may lack trust in the supplier organization. I mean, and this is not meant to say in a negative way. It's more saying that the consumer may not be aware of what was done in order to put this product together. So he or she may lack, or if it's an organizational consumer, may lack the confidence to say that I can really trust that this was designed with a certain level of assurance, like consideration of fairness, accountability, and so on. So we have a project that's going to look at a MSS that's with AI specific requirements that can allow for an assessment of conformance or accountability of the process down the line. And just to be clear, that would be a separate thing that would be done based on the MSS. And this can be used for trusted third party performing a check or audit, for instance. Again, this is a very new work. It's a novel approach that we are applying to try and deal with this issue that is top of mind for a lot of people looking to deploy AI. We have wrapped up work on this. I will just briefly mention that we had a system engineering advisory group that functioned a little bit like a study group and provided areas of work that could be picked up within SC42. Some of the work, for example, that you saw happen in Working Group 4 on the life cycle was a result of these discussions. And they wrapped up their work as of the last meeting. Again, I don't want to go through in detail all of the different areas that we're collaborating with, but if you remember, one thing is, we are working in collaboration with, both of our parents and their committees, as well as external organizations that are working on AI. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of these, even though they're a nice looking picture. But just in terms of concluding remarks, 42 is a first of its kind International Standards Committee, really looking at the full ecosystem. We've grown rapidly, and we now have 21 active projects with a robust program. We're engaging in extensive outreach and global collaboration. For example, the IEC communications team has just been fantastic in terms of coverage on a lot of the work that we have done, and providing detailed coverage on these topics. And so has the ISO team in providing also a look at how our technologies are being used. We are part of the IEC, ISO, and JTC1 families. I cannot stress this enough. I feel like we are really lucky to be in this setup, because we can really look to the diverse and numerous committees that have a tremendous amount of experience, some more than 40, 50 years, right? And so this is a great opportunity for us. It's really a good time to be engaged in this. There's a lot of market growth, and it's also a time where if you are interested, you can engage and help shape the outcome of the projects we work on. We do work through national committees, and for example, in the US, it's under ANSI, Germany, DIN, NSAI in Ireland, and so on. But if you are interested, if you reach out to any of us, we'll be able to help put you in the right contact. And here are some pre-COVID pictures when we were getting together. And I'm going to take a look at, if I can get my screen back up, some of the questions. Thank you, Rolf, for the kind words, and appreciate your support as well as the support of the SMB for our work. One question here is about the AI lifecycle. What happens if the software requires an update? Debugging, is this addressed in the ISO IEC standardization current or future plans? That's a really good question. I can come back to you with this. It's a very specific question, so I don't know the answer off the top of my head. What I do know is that we are leveraging a lot of the software best practices and requirements that are in, for example, the Square set of standards, but we are only sort of extending in areas for AI, just because AI has additional requirements, like, you know, if you try to port AI from one application to another, even if it's within the same vertical domain, the application requirement there may be new training that needs to happen. And I think anecdotally, one of the national committees presented data showing that there's roughly a 6x amount of manpower when stuff like that is ported versus a regular system. There's a question on whether anyone can access the use cases. Is it in a database or a document, and how do we do it? It currently is part of a technical report that would be published as a document. But that is a good question for us to look at to see if, as we grow, if there's another system that might be easier to use. And I think I have covered most of these questions. If I have not, I believe if you reach out to the IEC team, they will help answer these questions or help put you in touch with people that can. And I'm happy to take some questions. I would just defer to Sylvia if we have on the time. Oh.
We have about 3 minutes left. We have a few questions from the registration at the beginning, so I'll just post them in chat for you. Oh.
What is the current state of the functional safety AI working group? So it's actually, currently it's an initial project that's going to be a technical report in discussions with TC65, SC65A. It's being done in SC42 Working Group 3 with strong input via liaison. It is anticipated that at the completion of that project, some areas will be outlined, and there could potentially be follow-up projects that are done on the IEC side or in SC42 or both. But that work kicked off, I believe, a few months ago, so it's a good time to get engaged to be involved. Another question that is what we often talk about, segmenting into horizontal and vertical. Can that be done here, and how? Actually, that's a great question. And in fact, we are trying to do exactly that. I mean, maybe I use slightly different terminologies talking about domain specific versus horizontal or foundational, but we try to do the standardization work in JTC1 SC42 that looks at the horizontal portion of AI, big data, and associated analytics, right? And so we try to, whether it's using use cases to make sure that what we come up with works against that, or having more of a general approach, that is what we take. Unless one of our sister committees asks us to take a lead on something, typically we will engage with what you are terming as vertical, which is the application domains on their road mapping. And as I mentioned, you know, IEC and ISO provide a whole host of tool sets that we can use to make that happen, from either, you know, joint working groups all the way to liaisons and everything else. So we do, that's a very good question, and we are trying to do that. There's a question from our Facebook feed. How do standards keep up with the pace of development in AI tech? That's a really good question. And we have certainly seen that with some of these newer technologies, that there's a tremendous demand for having something publish faster. So fortunately for us, that we are afforded different types of deliverables that we can use depending on the topic. And sometimes that is a consideration. For example, getting a technical report out quickly to introduce the topic without normative references, and then following up with a technical specification or international standard. We also try to anticipate when we are reviewing these projects to have, a scoping that would be relevant to the time frame, right? That something is going to be relevant when we work on it. It will be when it's published, as well as when we're working on it, and it will be sort of have for lack of a better word, kind of a sticky effect. This is something that people will want to use moving forward, and there's lots of examples of that. The last thing I would say, it's also important to recognize that, we work in collaboration with other organizations. And sometimes, there may be a particular application need or and other committees that they can do quicker, and we help them do that. So that is a really good question, and it's something that we all continue to think about as more standardization comes out. And I think we're up to the end of our time. Thank you so much. There are some links that we can make available, and I will talk to the IEC communications team.